Hi, Dr. Christensen. Thank you so much for talking to me today.
You're welcome. Glad to be here.
Yeah, I just want to make sure it's okay with you if we record this interaction.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, awesome. Well, can you tell me a little bit more about yourself?
Sure. I grew up in Utah. I was born in Provo and grew up in Orem and went to BYU for my undergraduate, and then I went to University of Utah for med school. And then I decided I wanted to become a family physician and went down to Phoenix, Arizona to Good Samaritan residency, and that's where I did my residency in family medicine. So then I moved back up here to the Salt Lake Valley when it was time to practice, and I joined a multi-specialty group that at the time, called Granger Medical Clinic, at the time had 17 providers. They were the first practice to be on the west side of the Jordan River in the Salt Lake Valley. Started approximately 40 years before I got here, and by a few doctors who kind of pioneered that area out there.
Wow, that's amazing. I'd like to hear a little bit more about your experience this past year and kind of how your reaction has been to COVID.
So this is my 30th year of being in practice. So I've been seen a lot of things in family medicine. When I first started out, I had one assistant who took x-rays, drew blood, sent blood off, did everything. Now things have changed so much with digital images and all that sort of stuff. But 2020 brought new challenges that we've never seen before and no one ever anticipated or expected. And it all started for me when the last day I actually saw patients in a normal sort of way was Friday the 13th in March of 2020. And I remember seeing a few patients that day, wondering if we should be seeing patients or not, because we had word about a virus that had come from China and was causing illness, and nobody really knew too much about how it spread or any of those sort of things. And the reason that Friday was the last time we saw patients is because by Monday morning I had two partners who were positive for the COVID disease. And so they had seen patients that we knew that week who had coughs, and they were in proximity with them in what is now defined as a high-risk exposure because nobody had masks on. We didn't ever wear masks when we saw patients before. Even when people come in with colds or people had the flu in years past, doctors didn't wear masks. Patients never wore masks in our culture, and so it was kind of a new thing. But now, all of a sudden, Monday morning, I have 2 out of 5 of our practitioners in our pod who test positive for COVID and can't come to work. And we start to think back, boy, have I been exposed to them? Have I had what would be considered an exposure? Because if so, then I have to quarantine for 2 weeks. And so, my partner, we eat lunch in the same lunchroom, and probably the Thursday before the Monday that he was tested, had symptoms, we were in the lunchroom together. Was I right next to him? I don't think so, but not knowing how deadly or serious this disease was, we were all pretty nervous about it. So we pretty much had to close down our office, and our 2 practitioners who were sick stayed home, and the other people who were exposed stayed home, and I quarantined in the basement for 2 weeks. And it was one of the longest 2 weeks of my life, and I'll tell you that it was a good experience to get that right off the bat, to see what patients have to go through, because when you're down there alone and they slip food under the door for you, basically throw you a set of new clothes, and you start to lose touch with the outside world a little bit, even though we have connections, internet. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Time just seemed to stand still when you're in quarantine, and it felt like a day was a year. And that's sort of the same theme with this whole pandemic, is when we were in it 1 month, it felt like we were in it 10 years. And time has just really been crazy. And even when we went back to practice, we can talk a little bit more about when we actually got back to seeing patients, and it had been 2 or 3 months, it felt like forever. And people were getting tired of it already, but you're like, it's only been 3 months. We can do this stuff for longer. I mean, we have other diseases that people suffer with for years and years and years, but for some reason, where this is so widespread, and the fear and panic that it brought about seemed to make time stand still. But anyway, I was quarantined for 2 weeks, and in that 2 week time period where we shut down, all of a sudden you start worrying about how am I going to how we're going to do this. How am I going to make money for myself? How's my staff going to get paid? How are we going to pay our overhead? Because in a practice you have rent, you have utilities, you have supplies, you have lots of things that are ongoing even though nobody's working. And so all of a sudden it turns into different kind of worries than just being ill. It turns on, will my practice survive this economically? And it's interesting the timing for our civilization, because right at this time we were advanced enough that we were able to go straight into telehealth and see patients and take care of issues virtually. So initially that started out with me. I could stay online. My staff who weren't really exposed could go to the office and not be around people. Nobody came into the office, but they could be a hub to answer phone calls and take messages and send them to me online, and I could call people, and that's kind of how it started out. So pretty soon you're calling people about their medicine refill, or they're sick, and you're sort of doing this because they need it and not because you're charging them an appointment or anything. And then we realized that there are some platforms that we can actually do video and audio together, and it makes it much better. And it's interesting, as a side note, and maybe a dumb thing, but when I was growing up in the 60s, there was a cartoon called The Jetsons. And I don't know if you've ever seen The Jetsons, you're probably too young, but the people fly around in little cars in space. And at home, when they're home, they just push a little screen and they can talk to their doctor or their banker, or pretty much a lot of things they need to do, they can just do on a screen. And you thought back then when I was a kid how futuristic it is. And literally it's just like The Jetsons when we do that. And so our clinic, I mentioned that when I started out we had 17 providers, and we now have 150 providers. So we're a large multi-specialty clinic, and we have a well enough trained and savvy enough IT staff that they were able to help us within that first 2 weeks all get on a platform where we could actually have patients encounters online and with video and audio, and make it much more effective and safer, and we can talk about visits, how they work out in a second, but that's very important because it helps us stay in touch with people. People need refills. Asthmatics need their medicines. Diabetics need their insulin, and in those first couple of weeks at the end of March in Utah, the other thing that happened was an earthquake, and it shook a lot of people up, and in addition to the pandemic, so many people were feeling like this was the end of the world anyway, and it was I was afraid too. I mean, I had a lot of fear about what was all going on and how this was all going to happen, because you started to see people hoarding stuff, running on stores. We're losing supplies, gloves, antiseptics, toilet paper, things that you would never think there would be a shortage of. All of a sudden there was a shortage, and people were overbuying and kind of panicking. But the opportunity to do telemedicine was a little bit rough at first, but our IT staff got us set up to where we could do it, and it was great. But and going forward, as we've been able to do telemedicine, I did telemedicine for like 2 months. So I went into my office after hours to sign physical papers or to do some things. And we did have some lab open, or people who needed labs, if it was necessary, we'd get labs and that sort of thing. But for 2 months, I stayed at home and did practice medicine from upstairs loft. And you go online and you just see patients all day online, and it was kind of a crazy new experience. People were so grateful to be able to have that contact. It felt life-saving to them in a lot of ways to be able to contact their doctor and in this time of great panic and need to do that. As things progressed and eventually the community opened up and we went back and started to see some patients live and still see a lot of telehealth, now patients are grateful, but in a different way. They were grateful back then because, oh my goodness, I can get a hold of my doctor and he can help me through this problem. Now they're grateful because they can be at work and take a 15-minute break and have a doctor's visit, and they don't ever have to leave their work, pull into the parking lot, wait in the waiting room, any of that sort of stuff. And it's also been very interesting with telehealth in some ways, because in the office everybody's now wearing protective equipment. So I see a patient with a mask and a shield on, and they have a mask, and it feels a little bit strained, not as intimate as it used to be. But on a telehealth visit, you're seeing each other very close on a screen with no mask on. And so there are many medical problems that really make that venue a great option. And so I'm still seeing about 2/3 telehealth patients and 1/3 live patients who need to be seen for whatever reason. If I need to examine a knee, I can't do that telehealth very well. But you can look at rashes, you can talk about psych problems, you can adjust medications, people can check their blood pressure. There's a lot of things you can do. And telehealth has become very convenient and effective for many things. It wouldn't have happened without the pandemic, even though we had the technology to be able to just do it right away, which I don't think we could have 5 years ago. We had to have the help of the insurance company saying, okay, we'll reimburse for it. Because in the past, they wouldn't reimburse for it, or they reimburse far less than an in-person visit. And now that it's become a way of doing things, it will probably be here forever in some manner. Once the COVID crisis is over, they might reduce reimbursement, but it made it ability of practices to be able to stay open because they could still charge for the services that were legitimate that they provide to patients.
Yeah, wow. It's so interesting to see how that mobilization happened so quickly and how what we've learned from this might actually change healthcare delivery going forward.
It'll change it forever. There's no question. People like it. Doctors like it. It's already become noted that it can work, for the right things. So yeah, it's going to change the way medicine is delivered forever.
Wow. Well, that was a huge hurdle that those in your office had to overcome when this began. What other sorts of unique challenges do you think you were able to experience during this pandemic because you are a part of a healthcare delivery system?
Well, it's interesting being in this business because you talk about essential businesses, and you'd think that practice of medicine would be essential, and it is, yet many providers in medicine could have lost their whole practices because of the economic impact. When they shut down, surgeons weren't able to do procedures at surgical centers, and there's such a shortage of gloves and other protective equipment that they said, we got to save these for people who are infected. And so all of a sudden, somebody who's trained and can help people with problems that still exist, even though other people are getting sick with a pandemic or not getting sick, they aren't allowed to do that. As a practitioner, there's always the worry that, do we know enough about it? Do I have enough equipment that I can see patients and help them without getting sick and dying myself? I wouldn't be able to help anybody if I got sick and died. And so you have to be smart about how you practice. And so there's all these kind of conflicting concerns. But our staff was amazing. They came to work every day through the shutdown. They social distanced. They had masks. They talked to people. They did everything they could to solve problems. We worked over online and through telephone conversation to take care of people. And there were some days when I think a lot of people were pretty discouraged and wondering how this was all going to work. But our staff was amazing. And we also have people in our administration who were just heroes. They decided they're going to buckle down and fight this thing and hit it head on. So we were able to do that. I happen to be on the board of directors of our company, and we normally have one meeting a month to discuss things. We were meeting weekly for 2 and 3 hours a meeting, trying to discuss how we're going to do things and what protocols we can do to keep people safe and how we can continue to help the community and be up to speed with everything that's going on. And it was kind of an exciting time to see how things evolve. I remember when I was in med school, they just had learned about the HIV virus when I first started. When I ended, they were able to diagnose AIDS and call it what it was. So it took 4 years, or 3 to 4 years to go through that. And now you're seeing real medicine happening where they're discovering and making new treatments and things that we've never known before. So to be on the cutting edge of that is pretty neat.
Yeah, that is really neat. I'm interested to hear your perspective about the PPE shortage.
Yeah, so the first thing that happened is when you start thinking about how are we going to protect our staff and ourselves with protective equipment, which includes gloves and masks and shields, which we typically don't use for most things in primary care, and gowns. You start to look in your closet, and all of a sudden you're like, well, we have what we would normally use, but if we have to use this for every patient, we don't have enough of this stuff, and so you start to look at, and clinic-wide in a multi-specialty group of 150 practitioners, you realize you don't have enough of this stuff, so you got to figure out a way to stop using it or to get more stuff. We had placed lots of orders, which everyone in the country had, and many of our orders were diverted by the federal government to go to other places that were of higher need. And so we tried to figure out how we were going to do this and keep ourselves safe. And one of the things that I thought would be most helpful would be face shields, and because there was already a community effort to sew masks, but nobody knew how to necessarily make a safe mask. But there was a community effort to sew masks, and my wife was thinking one day out of the box, and she figured out a way to get materials to make face shields of materials that were available. If you tried to order medical face shields, they wouldn't come to you; they would be diverted. But we were able to order plastic protective covers that are normally used for presentations, and cut them in a way and use weather stripping and use Coban to make a face shield. So this is our face shields that we made. It's just a plastic vinyl 10 mil with a piece of weather stripping, and we bought whole rolls of it and cut it, and then we just used Coban, which was available, to make the strap. And Coban can be replaced and easily purchased, and so we just bought a bunch of raw supplies which were available because they weren't necessarily out of stock because of COVID, and we re-engineered them to make face shields. We originally did that for our own company, and then we thought, well, why not make them for more people? And we had some innovative people in our group that decided that they could let's make 5,000 of them, and decided to get some community help. And so she was able to get funding for them, and we were able to buy large quantities of these samples, and we were able to mobilize the community to make face shields. And in the end, we placed over 9,500. We sent them to the Navajo reservation. We sent them to private offices in this valley and all along the Wasatch Front, all the way down into New Mexico. I had school teachers who have requested a few boxes of them to use when their kids came back to school. And so it became a very cool, positive project that helped in a time of real negative things going on to maybe divert our attention and say, hey, here's something we're doing positive. And it really helped our practice, and I'm still using mine today, because shortly after we got these developed, one of the major players in our community came out and said all patient interactions should have a face shield with them. And this large company made face shields for their whole group, but if you weren't affiliated with their group, there weren't any available to you. And so this provided an opportunity for a lot of people who were in a different situation to have them. And it was great to see how the community took them, and we're grateful for them.
Yeah, that's a really innovative and heroic effort. And it sounds like Utah would have been probably lower on the queue to receive federal help.
Yeah, absolutely. That's why everything got diverted from Utah. It was back in the time when New York was having all their problems, and bigger cities with more political clout and more higher populated areas were getting things. So Utah was not really high. And we're one clinic group in Utah. So, and think about the other private practitioners that are smaller groups that just had no leverage to get those kind of supplies. So it was a cool thing, and it worked out really well. And it was very effective, and our group is still using all of those shields.
Yeah, it's really neat to me that since Utah wasn't going to get outside help, Utah community came together to help Utah and to really stand up against that virus. I think that's really awesome.
It was great, and we had a lot of neighbors who helped out,
yeah.
And people in the community took them home. Their families assembled those, and we had a kind of a little procedure that we tried to keep them safe from contamination after we got everything assembled. And so it worked out great. It was a neat project.
That is really neat. So this is kind of a personal question, but I know that you might have a different perspective on this virus because you are a person in a higher risk population.
Yeah, so So I have an autoimmune disorder, and I was on medication to blunt my immune system, and I'm 60 this year. So for a number of reasons, I fit into a high risk category. So it makes me a lot more afraid of the virus, to be honest, and it makes me not want to be in a place of risk, because again, I obviously want to save myself, but if I go down, I can't treat any patients. And everybody wants to be taken care of, and we should protect everybody. But having higher risk does make it a little more high anxiety, and you're a little more careful about things, and it helps you also empathize with those who are also at high risk. So the elderly, and I have lots of other patients who are in my same category who are immunosuppressants, and I understand that. And so I understand what it's like to quarantine. I know how terrible that is. I understand what it's like to be in a high-risk group and feel more worried maybe than the normal person would feel.
Yeah, so things that I would be interested in talking about are, building off of your experience, having higher anxiety and being more worried about this. There are a lot of people that don't necessarily understand that same anxiety for the virus, and that have a hard time understanding why quarantining is important and why following these kind of guidelines really matter. And I don't know if there's anything you can say that might help them to understand what the fear or worries are of some of the people in our society who are at higher risk.
Well, everybody knows someone who's at high risk. If you have parents or grandparents, or you might not have people who who are on immunosuppressants, but people who are elderly who are in that category, and you have to think about them and keeping them safe. It's interesting because our older community is pretty well set up to do that. They're retired. They get a check in the mail. They don't have to go to work. They can actually stay home and stay away from people for the most part in many cases. And a lot of my patients are doing just that. They're also of the vintage where they're just going to hunker down and go take care of their garden, and they're going to stay away from people because that's what they're supposed to do. And it seems like they're better able to handle this time warp that I talked about than the younger people. And the younger people, it feels like it's been too much time. For the older people, they're like, well, we'll just keep doing it until we get through this thing, And so I felt like the older community is very well prepared to do this, and most of my patients are pretty committed to it. The places where it hasn't been, such as when they want to see grandkids, and it's dangerous, but some people can't not do it, and other people are like, we're just going to quarantine until it's over, and because we don't want to get it. They're deathly afraid of it. These people some of them lived through polio and all those kind of things, where they were probably kids, but when you got polio, you didn't necessarily die of it, but you could become paralyzed and lose strength in a limb. And I have some patients who had polio when they were young back in the polio epidemic, and now they have post-polio syndrome. And so they've been through a time in their lives where we didn't have all these treatments we have, where medicine couldn't take care of everything. Nowadays, we think medicine should be able to solve everything, and this is a real wake-up call to us to know that it may not be able to solve everything. There might be other behavioral things we have to do. And so I would just say, think about the people who are at high risk, and look out for other people. The best thing we can do in our community through this is to try to look out for other people, because that's what quarantine was very bad for me for, was it brings you so much on your self-focus. You start worrying about yourself. And if you keep watching the news during quarantine and you see how bad things are, and you're alone a lot of that time, you turn everything in and you just worry about me. When you can turn yourself outward and look at other people and help other people and see what other people are doing and send them a text or do something to make their day, it changes your whole outlook.
Yeah, your perspective is really insightful. So I'm interested about something else. This is kind of jumping back in our conversation, but I know you talked about some of the conversations you were a part of with your medical staff, kind of in an administrative sense, where you were trying to figure out going forward how you might want to structure things. Are you able to talk about any of the administrative things that happened among hospital chains or among other kind of larger healthcare entities in the state?
Yeah, I mean, I had the opportunity, like I said, I was on the board of directors for our group, and I have been able to be in weekly huddles that happened during the COVID time through with some of the larger medical players in the community and the Utah Medical Association, where they had live Zoom meetings or telephone meetings where you could participate in and kind of see what's going on. And you know, as doctors, we try to rely on the science. Science is made of theories, and there's a bunch of things that came down that initially were thought to be science, and then we found out there weren't. There were medicines that we thought, oh, this will really help, and then we found out later it's not going to help. But we, you know, these organizations tried to take the best minds together and, well, put our heads together and look at CDC guidelines and look at what we know and say, how does this translate into how we practice? How do we keep our people safe? How do we keep patients safe? What's the best way to test them? Should they be tested in a building where they can aerosolize it throughout the building, or do we test them in cars? And now we should set up a system where they can call before they come, so we know exactly what we're dealing with when we get there. And how do we keep other patients safe who need to be seen, who don't have COVID and might be at high risk or whatever? And so a lot of these policies have had lots and lots and lots of talking through and deciding what to do. And in our own group, we have lots of employees with 150 providers, and they're all spread across all different specialties. And so there are different challenges for each specialty. OB, for instance, doesn't stop. Kids don't stop coming just because there's COVID here. If a lady's pregnant and she's going to deliver, she's going to deliver. And so, you know, but we want to set up protocols to keep people safe, that people will know how to take care of themselves, and we don't ever want to put anybody in harm's way. So there's a lot of dialogue, a lot of back and forth, a lot of difference of opinions shared as to how we do things. How are we going to do it? How is the community doing it? Are we going to line up with them? And you know, in the end, it felt great, because it felt like in the circles that I was in, I felt like people really wanted to do the right thing for the right reason and protect and help people along the way. So it was a very interesting to see how that happens, and to see that there are good people in medicine, and there are leaders who stand out. You know, the leaders in our community during this time have risen to the top and risen to the challenge, have become better. The people in our group, I'm just impressed at how they've handled it and how they've shown true leadership through this kind of a crisis.
Yeah. Wow, that really is amazing to see how this group effort comes together in a time when there are challenges. That united front can really bring a lot of security.
Yeah. And you know, we don't know what's going to happen next, because we're in a situation now where we have more cases now than we've ever had before. We're hitting new records every day, and they're actually finally talking about the unthinkable. And what we're trying to avoid is rationing ICU healthcare. And there's been talks with all of these groups that we just mentioned about this, and nobody ever thought it would come to this, and we don't know if it really will. But it's become clear that this isn't going away right away. And so, while we've crossed lots of hurdles and we know a lot more than we did 9 or 10 months ago, we don't know where this is going to take us yet. And hopefully we can keep making good choices and do the right thing that will keep the most number of people safe.
Yeah. I think these next couple months will be as have been the ones before, just unprecedented in so many ways.
Yeah, I think you're right. We don't know what's ahead of us yet. But we're better prepared than we were, and hopefully we've made good decisions along the way, and we have better supplies than we've had, but there's always something.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Christensen, thank you so much for speaking with me today and helping us understand a little more about what you've been able to see and experience during this really unprecedented and historic time.
You're welcome. Thank you.